Okay, so this is a description of Nachtraglichkeit, this Freudian theory of trauma. And the theory, very briefly, is that a neurotic symptom or an effect will arise from a psychic trauma which follows an event which revives an earlier event. The key thing here is the idea of revival. So there is, in effect, there are two events, and there is a period of dormancy in between the two events. And event number 2, in effect, revives event number 1. And the idea is that in event number 1, the first event, the person is not able to react adequately or react appropriately, perhaps because they're too young or too scared or too invulnerable in some way. And there's only a reaction, an emotional reaction, when a second event somehow revives that first event. And Freud talks about a primordial or original trauma. He says the primordial trauma functions as the point of origin for all subsequent pathology. And the basis of Freud's early seduction theory is that trauma occurs when sexuality intrudes too soon. In other words, when the child is subjected to sex or sexuality by the adult, sometimes in quote-unquote innocent ways, but the child is not in a place and doesn't have the sort of symbolic means of making sense of sexuality. And for Lacan, sexuality is always potentially traumatic, but both for the child who lacks the symbolic means, lacks the language and the means of comprehension to deal with it, but also for all human subjects, for adults as well, because the symbolic system, the linguistic system, lacks the elements, lacks the signifiers to bind sexuality. Sexuality it's not bound by language, whereas most other things can be bound by language, can be contained by language. Sexuality can't be. It's outside of anything that can be signified. And in the idea of Nachtraglichkeit, by the way, is an early one of Freud's. It comes from studies in hysteria, and Freud describes the case of Emma Eckstein. And there are two things that happen to the young Emma when she's very young, perhaps 5 or 6. She's sexually assaulted in a shop. The shopkeeper gropes her through her clothes. That's the first event. The second event happens when she's an early teenager, again in a shop, and the second event is that the shopkeepers are laughing at Emma's clothes. Now, in the first event, there seems to be no traumatic reaction. After the sexual assault, there seems to be no emotional reaction for Emma. But after the second event, which seems to be a milder one, there's a significant emotional reaction. And it's because Emma experiences the second event through the prism of a sexual knowledge that she didn't have in the first event. And this in turn revives the original, the first experience, which wasn't traumatic at the time for her, or at least didn't provoke a traumatic reaction, but does now. So there's a strange sort of paradox here, that the sort of pathological power of the second event is drawn from the first event, from the first experience. But the first experience is only made traumatic through the experience of the second event. And it's a sort of dialectical relationship between these two events, rather than one event or the other event on its own, which produces the trauma. And it's not even that the latter event, the second event, Emma being laughed at, as a teenager. It's not even that that kind of evokes this old wound, because the wound that you might think should arise from the original early childhood sexual assault, that wound doesn't exist until the second event creates it. So we can ask, why is it that the revival of the memory of the second event causes this traumatic pathology, whereas the original action didn't? In other words, why wasn't Emma more immediately affected by the original sexual assault? And the answer that Freud suggests is that because when she experienced it, something was missed. There was something missing in Emma's ability to comprehend and in a way fully experience that event, that assault. And it's only during the intervening period, during early puberty perhaps, that Emma learns something about what the original experience means. So we can say that that first event, the sexual assault, is missed because Emma doesn't have the means, the young 5-year-old Emma doesn't have the means of symbolising it or understanding it. But it's not that the assault completely has leaves no trace. It does leave a trace. It leaves a memory trace. And there are certain symbols which seem to connect the two events. There's the shop. There's Emma's clothes. She was groped through her clothes in the first event. Her clothes were laughed at in the second event. There seems to be a leering or a smiling that occurs in both events. And those kind of key signifiers in the original event both signal that event. They are, when she experiences those, the smile, the clothes, the shop in the second event, they're the sparks which remind her of the first event, but they also kind of cover up the real trauma of the first event. And those symbols, the clothes, the smile, become kind of dissociated from other elements in the scene. They're cut off from the rest of that scene, and they therefore become meaningless and senseless until they are revived in the second event. So we can say that psychically the first event only occurs as a psychic event when the second event occurs. Emma's sexual assault only occurs psychically for her when she is laughed at 6, 7, 8 years later in the shop. And it's only through the second event that the first event can be experienced subjectively. So you could almost say that when Emma is laughed at in the shop in the second event, both that event and the earlier assault are both experienced for the first time simultaneously. There is this double trauma. Now, psychoanalysis will sometimes suggest, or usually describe, that original experience, the assault, as having been repressed. But that suggests that original event has a sort of substantial existence, which has been repressed and pushed down. But Freud argues, and Laplanche argues much later on, that that's not the case. Psychically, the first event doesn't exist. It's lying. It doesn't substantially exist anyway. It's lying dormant and it's waiting to be revived. So it's a slightly involved explanation. I hope it's kind of clear. I think it's possibly something which could almost be made a bit clearer with a diagram of how. I think kind of the key thing is that in the Emma Eckstein example, she experiences the early trauma for the first time when the second trauma occurs. So she experiences a double trauma the second time around. And this has real diagnostic implications. Because if a psychiatrist just looked at Emma and listened to her tell the story of being laughed at in the shop, he might just look at that, consult his DSM-5 manual, and perhaps diagnose her as having some sort of specific social anxiety disorder. If one focuses solely on the event which immediately precedes the trauma, one may misdiagnose and crucially miss the crucial objective and subjective events which create the trauma. In this case, one might miss the original sexual assault that Emma experienced when she was 5, and one might miss the way in which that and the later trauma of being laughed at in the shop colour each other and influence each other and in a way create each other. So I hope that is a reasonably clear explanation of Nachtraglichkeit. As I say, I think it has implications outside of trauma as well. I think it's one of the sort of quiet, not widely talked about, but incredibly important and very kind of positive ideas of psychoanalysis.